that data is all sliced up into little packets, 1,500 bytes. So it takes one packet at a time, and we'll send that packet to the next best router at that point in time. So these are, just saying their routers there, our internet service providers sit on the edge of that cloud, or those tier one providers provide the cloud, but they're out here, and most of the internet providers that we're interested in are also the telephone company. The local telephone company is involved in our connection to the internet, so we can't leave them out of there. A lot of telephone companies are internet service providers. They sit on the internet backbone, so the two aren't mutually exclusive. But when we talk about telephone company, we're talking about people that operate telephone switches. And a telephone switch is literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to get into that market. And you can't have just one. Everything's got to be redundant. This is big scale utility class stuff that they do. So a telephone company is usually an option as your internet service provider. But the important thing is they are the ILEC. They are the incumbent local exchange carrier. They're the ones that own the infrastructure there. They built the telephone company's switching offices. They put up all the telephone company circuits on telephone poles and under the ground. They are the telephone company. There are also CLECs out there. They are competing local exchange carriers. And they can either buy their own telephone company switch. If they want to put out millions of bucks into a telephone exchange, they can. But the incumbent LEC is obligated to provide services to the competing LEC in their building. And literally, since they get kind of crowded anyway, lots of them have had to, build sheds and other facilities just to house their competing local exchange carriers. So they can literally come from all over the world. My favorite ones in this area are Megapath. Covad Megapath ended up being a Filipino-based company. So when you talk about your account or you call for tech support there, you're talking to somebody in the Philippines that is, examining your network connection and telling you what's going on. So these local exchange carriers are often internet service providers, but they have got lots of competition for that too. So they're out there, and what we want them to have is several routers in their facility that they can use to hook us up to the internet. And like I said, when a router sends traffic, a router can send it most anywhere, and these circuits tend to be way interconnected out here. We've got my Covad in Bon Air actually connects directly up to the Equinix up in Northern Virginia, where other internet service providers down here connect through Richmond. They kind of bypass Richmond and go farther up north. So we've got lots of routers, and they're pretty much interconnected. One router can be connected to several other routers, and a router can be connected to another router with more than one circuit. So whatever we got through here, we got a choice of routes. Yes, sir.
What is that red above ISP that's underlined?
Telco.
Okay.
Telephone company.
Okay.
And this is incumbent local exchange carrier. This is competing local exchange carrier. So any rate, so we got routes here, and routers. What's the protocol routers use? What do they use to move traffic with? Internet router, internet protocol. They use IP. So if we come out here and look at routers involved in the internet, they use IP, and sometimes you hear that along with TCP. IP, TCP configures a virtual connection through the internet. It reaches out to somebody's router on the other side and connects to that server or that business, whatever you've got on the other side of the internet. So internet protocol, TCP, are used to move the traffic through there. And routers also make an informed decision when they decide where to send the next packet. They do RIP is the older one, Router Interface Protocol, and OSPF is Open Shortest Path First, and their decisions are informed by metrics. So all the other routers nearby and over the horizon, by the way, are transmitting back their metrics. They're saying, you know, how many packets were dropped in this most recent period. They're saying what's the latency, what's the throughput through this route. So they're always firing back the metrics to other routers, and then when a packet shows up to be dispatched, it goes on the best path. And it's not a bad thing. If we got 5 paths for data to happen, then we can get data through the internet maybe 5 times as fast. You call that inverse multiplexing, where you take a transmission and split it up into multiple routes. But at any rate, these things are pretty robust, and they really, even a backbone-sized router is a $20,000 or $30,000 device. You don't have the expense in them as you do the telephone company switches. And of course, anybody can play on the internet. All they need to do is be attached to a router. Sometimes we got the router in our location. Other times, the first router that we come to on our connection is the one at the internet service provider. So this is out here. Metrics, by the way, can include expense. So part of what the router uses in making the best choice there is how much this circuit costs. If it's a metered circuit and you're paying so much for bandwidth, then the router includes that in its metric evaluation to decide where to dispatch this packet. So it would rather send it on a free network or a fixed rate network if it could, but if it's metered, then it would not choose that, everything else being available. So at any rate, that's how the internet works with routers and with TCP IP. Router Interface Protocol, Open Short Path First are out there, and let's connect this to a business here, and none of this is to scale, by the way. So here is a business, and somehow or other we've got to connect them to this telephone company, and what I'm drawing a detailed picture of now, this is typically called the last mile. This is that wire. Usually it's wire that connects us to the internet service provider. And in practical terms, the last mile can be up to about 5 miles long. That's how long it works for its intended purposes. So that last mile is generally in an urban area within 5 miles of a central office. Now, some of the central offices are automated, so they're just out there. But lots of them, of course, have got offices in there, and that's got to be within about 5 miles. And traditionally, this has been Bell Telephone Company, and more recently, Velcro ate them all up, Verizon ate them all up, and so now the ordinary incumbent LEC in an area is likely to be Verizon. That means through their acquisitions, they've ended up with facilities for the telephone company in most areas. By the way, anybody live out in the boonies? I take care of a couple accounts out Urbana way, and out in the hinterlands there, for decades and decades, it was GTE, General Telephone and Electric, and they had brown sheds. Most of them were automated, and they operated the equipment that it took to amplify that telephone line farther than 5 miles. So if you were out in the boonies, it used to be you paid a premium for it, by the way, GTE. And I guess it's been 3 years ago now that Verizon came along and ate them up too. So they haven't changed the color of the paint on the sheds, they're still brown, but the one I drive past has got still got that old emblem on the door. The Verizon emblem has replaced the emblem on the door. So this is GTE operated way out there, so these could be longer, but practically less than 5 miles. Some services are distance limited, by the way. And DSL, anybody got DSL in here, by the way? Nobody will admit to DSL anymore. You got it?
Well, I'm actually from Powhatan.
Mm-hmm.
We had DSL up until last year.
Mm-hmm.
We finally switched to Comcast because FiOS is still not available.
All right.
We've been using Verizon DSL for the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become or not 10 years, probably 5 or so. And it just got to where we couldn't use anything else.
No. What bandwidth was it running at?
I don't know. I think the download speed was less than half a megabyte a second.
Yeah, that's it.
And upload was less than that.
If you're out on the end of that, then you're lucky. Now mine, I'm at 5.2 miles. If they measure the equipment, it's some 100 feet or 1,000 feet, and it's 5.2 miles. And I can set my equipment for 3 megabits, but I get better throughput if I set it for 1.5 megabits. And just if I try to run it too fast, it loses lots of packets and things. So if I run it 1.5, now it's a commercial circuit, so I'm getting a better share out of that bandwidth. I'm getting something like 128K. Nothing like the full spectrum of it, but respectable amount there for what I need to do with it. So, at any rate, we'll talk more about what would be on that last mile, and we've got a couple of others in this last mile where the telephone company actually needs to come along and provision these circuits. So that through the community, they've got, well, the ordinary one is a T1 can. They actually come out here and hang stuff on the telephone poles to take care of their customers' bandwidth. Now, the big deal, what our creditors would call this is commercial bandwidth. We got to put telephone and or internet in a business. What are the services available for it? And by the way, keep in mind that we do have all the competing services that we got at home that are so wonderful. In some neighborhoods, Comcast is even good. In most neighborhoods, FiOS is very well managed, very good. And those services are available for business customers, but not at residential rates. They don't, whether the 79 bucks or 59 bucks a month, whatever you're paying for FiOS, I can pay 89, I think, and get a gigabit off it, but I just don't need it, so I'm stuck at my, I think, 30 megabits, which is fine for what we do around my house. But this commercial bandwidth has tended to be based around the public switch telephone network, and the digital and the analog services, but mostly the digital part of it. So commercial bandwidth, one that I need to talk about, one of the services I need to talk about is POTS. Anybody know that acronym there, POTS? That is a POTS line. Did Google come with it that fast there? That is plain old telephone service. This has been pretty much unchanged since the 1930s as far as what it does. We came along, made some upgrades to it through the 60s and again in the middle 90s, so you can pretty much get to everywhere in the world with a touch-tone phone, and that's the PSTN, Public Switch Telephone Network. Has been compatible worldwide since about 1996 or thereabouts. So we've got access to that on our digital networks, and we've also got direct access to the internet on them. So we use these old telephone circuits to get to anywhere we need to go. The last mile in my grandmother's neighborhood was installed in the early 1950s, and nothing about it has been switched out or changed since then. So this infrastructure is on the poles and in the ground to handle those plain old telephone circuits. Now, if I was taking care of a server in a customer's location, remember I've been liberated now, all of mine are at Rackspace Cloud. I would keep a POTS line with a modem on it so that I could have dial-up access to that server in case the internet is down. Some things to diagnose what's going on and figure out who to call require that you have access to the server, and you can't do that if your only connection is by the internet. So POTS line is one way to do that relatively inexpensively, but relatively cheap, 29 bucks or so a month. If you have to use it for data, you're not going to get reliable above about 28.8 kilobits per second. So that's slow, and it may be slower than that. The absolute best you can get off them is like 48.8 or 56K if everything is just perfect. But these modems, they have to negotiate the bandwidth that that connection can support at that time, and they do go through bad connections. So this is, anybody heard a modem connect in this class? Oh, where'd you hear that?
Modem connect? Back in the hole.
Oh, you mean some time ago?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
yeah, not recently.
Yeah, well, you don't look that old, but this is the ordinary way. Now, we didn't have streaming video. We sure didn't have streaming video, and had very few graphics. And but we were using the internet at 19.2 kilobaud and 9600 baud. So modems really slow, but these days I wouldn't call that a source for commercial bandwidth. You might want that one for the administrator to get in, but to wire up that office you need more. And I'm blocking on this one. Would somebody please Google on ISDN PRI and BRI? And the PRI is the primary rate interface. The BRI is the basic rate interface. Anybody got that yet? One of them has 22 circuits, the other one has 2, and I am blocking on which one has more. Find that yet? There it is. BRI uses 2 bearer channels, and each one of them is 64K. If you put them together for internet, then that gives you 128K. You can use one for telephone. It takes 64K to transmit a voice signal, by the way. That's where they came up with all this 64K stuff. When the telephone company is figuring out your voice, to digitize it, to put it in their digital network, they sample that 8,000 times a second, and every second it writes a byte. So that is 64K, 64K bytes of data per second. That's the what it takes to support a low telephone call. And by the way, it's clipped, doesn't get you much better than 8,000 cycles per second, but I'm deaf above 8,000 cycles per second, so it doesn't bother me. But this is, in lots of countries, the ordinary residential line is an ISDN basic rate interface. And in most United States markets, the ILEC or the CLEC can offer ISDN. It's good service. It's powered on both ends. It is instantaneous, so if you need to make a connection, it will reach right out there and hit the other end in something less than 1/8 of a second. So this is a digital service, integrated services digital network. So this is the minimum packaging of it. The primary rate interface, depending upon where you are, gets 22 or 24 times 64K, and that gets us up to about 1.5 megabits per second. So now we're put all those together for data, and we've got practically enough to stream a high definition video, which takes more than 1.5 megabytes. So this is barely enough to support what we would do in a residence. But if all we're using that for is telephone and text for an internet, for 15 years that was sufficient. You could put a mail server there and service that on that connection here. The PBX for this primary rate interface can split these up into as many as 22 different telephone numbers. So when you order ISDN service, if you have it provisioned for telephone, you get a little strip that fits into your punch-down block with 22 telephone numbers on it. So ISDN can give you that now. You can also use all 22 channels for internet without any telephone service. So however you want to put it up there, there is a little ISDN router that will handle that for you. So ISDN is an ordinary way to provision telephone service. If you got more than 5 or 6 numbers at that location, then the ISDN, the primary rate interface, starts being attractive. For the basic rate interface, that's roughly $19 a month, up to a maximum $79 if you stay connected all the time. If you get the circuit, it comes with 10 hours of connect time on its B channels, bearer channels, and if you go past the 10 hours, then the telephone company meters that at 1 penny per minute per bearer channel. And by the way, if you're using the internet and the 64K is enough for what's going on, it opens one line. If you get a steady stream of traffic or need to transmit up, then it'll engage the other line. So if you've got this primary rate interface, it can engage as many lines as it wants to handle that transmission at that time. So ISDN, in most neighborhoods, it's in practically all business neighborhoods, and I've hooked businesses up to ISDN literally for decades. And if you needed more bandwidth and that's the only service you got in your neighborhood, then you just get a couple more ISDN lines if you don't have huge needs for bandwidth. And the ISDN routers and private business exchanges will negotiate that for you. So ISDN is out there. The next bump up for commercial service is the T1. And by the way, in Europe, that's the E1. And since about the middle 90s, T1 system and E1 system have been compatible, and they are on the public switch telephone network. So most of the time I see T1 called the basic unit of digital networking. This is, if you get this, it gives you 24 64 K-bit channels that you can use, and if you multiply that out, that gives you 1.54 megabits per second. And this is bidirectional there. You call it full duplex, so you've got that bandwidth up. At the same time, you've got that bandwidth down. And the most important thing about this when you hear the price of it is that you're not sharing this bandwidth with anybody. You are getting that full bandwidth. This is not, circuit doesn't go through a router. This goes through telephone company switch. This goes through what's called a time division multiplexer. So you always get your time on that signal. And there's no latency for connect either. It's if the circuit on the other end is available, kablam, it opens it and it's just there. And just like the ISDN, you can use some of it for telephone and some of it for internet. So it works there. Most neighborhoods have got it, especially, I should say most business neighborhoods have got it. We've got it in our neighborhood, and I just got a special promotion, by the way. I knew it was coming into the neighborhood, or I noticed it when it went up. This is a T1 repeater can, and this has got to be on that last mile about every mile and a half or so. So if you've driven around the countryside or your neighborhood and you see these things hanging on telephone poles, that is a T1 repeater can. Now this is just splicing in. This is to a pedestal, is putting cables together somewhere. So if we need to connect the cable to that, we just come out of this repeater can and into that last mile wire. And there's one that comes out of the ground for that purpose. So now whoever ordered that thing, and we got a bunch of gun dealers in our neighborhood and they're all getting better connected, they had to pay probably $1,800 or so to get that T1 provisioned. But now that it's out there, Verizon put it in. Now the guys in the Philippines know that there is space in that can. So they're coming along to make me a sweetheart deal of $175 a month for a T1 circuit at my home office. I don't need it, but it'd be pretty good. Now, $19.99, last T1 that I provisioned for a customer, that was $1,200 a month, $1,200 a month to get that 1.54 megabits. So we do live in relative bandwidth heaven here. River City's got the lowest rates for digital networking as anywhere in the world for some reason. We were the first neighborhood, by the way, to roll out FiOS, which we'll talk about in a little while, but it's amazing to see that kind of pricing for it. Once that can is there, now they're motivated to sell the other 11 spots in it. So here's T1. I'll say, well, I couldn't get it that way. $279 to something like $500 a month for a T1 circuit. Most reliable circuit you can get. This is only thing wrong with it is it's only 1.54 megabits, so won't work for streaming data if there's more than one person wants to do it. You don't share this bandwidth with anybody. It is there all the time. Next bump up off of traditional services is the T3, and that's telephone carrier 3, by the way, in the United States, and the equivalent European equipment is the E3. And I forget how many channels that one has got in there. You can look it up. It can be used for telephone, but most people don't. Most people just get it provisioned for data. And it gives you, check up after me, I believe it is 44.7 megabits per second. And depending upon what kind of deal you can make, that's going to be $750 a month plus. Now, we had them at Maggie Walker, and we got a real sweetheart deal, so that we got the pair of them for something like $1,100 a month. But that was enough to handle what video they need to stream in classrooms and students' mobile devices there. So this is commercial bandwidth can work with the public switch telephone network, but getting us up to the kind of bandwidth that you can actually, several people can stream video now. We got, if you need more bandwidth, then you get a couple of them. You put them together, your equipment can handle several of these circuits. So that is T1, T3. Now all of these are in the public switch telephone network, and these are what you'd call traditional services, by the way, and if we round that out with their optical services, OC3 gets you up to 155 megabits per second, and that's going to cost, something like, I'll just peg it at 800 through a couple $1,000s a month. And if you really need a lot of bandwidth, then you would be in OC12 neighborhood. That gets you up to 655 megabits per second. And there we're starting probably for numbers like $2,500 up to $8,000 a month. So look at your price charts, see if you found any specials that I'm not aware of. I'll lower that lower price. They just keep going down. How many businesses can you be in where the cost of services plummets as a result of legislation? Now remember, all this stuff didn't start plummeting until after the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So since the late 90s, our costs for these services have literally plummeted. Now, these are traditional, these come to our business on fiber optics. So we've got to be in the neighborhood that's got optical carrier. OC stands for optical carrier. So we've got to locate somewhere that has that. In Richmond, that's our office parks, Boulders, South Side, Innsbrook, West End, all of that stuff out there between Richmond and the airport, East End. That was Commando and is now Tier 2 and 3 data centers. So this is really a lot of bandwidth that you can get on those optical circuits. And they go up, by the way, but I'm not privy to any pricing on it. And of course, the backbone providers are operating crazy fast, like OC 192 and OC 256, I think, is just released in the past few years. Now here, in many cases, they're still using the same fiber circuits that have been in the ground or under the water for a long time, but they have improved the equipment on either end. As long as you treat it okay, glass pretty much lasts forever. So they can come back in and refit their cables to carry faster and faster stuff as the equipment comes along. So that's the OC optical carrier, if you can do that. There's also plenty of competing services. If I was putting up a business, needed phones, needed database, I would make sure that I checked with Covad first. I'd call them, see if they could do the whole thing, see what their price is. Then I'd go talk to Verizon, and I'd probably want to ask United States local exchange carrier. They all want to compete with one another, and it's something that you do have to go out and bid. Now, you can also go after the competing services. Most of our telephone companies have got DSL, so that is not one of our traditional telephone services. This was a competing service. DSL, bandwidth-wise, you are sharing your bandwidth with your area multiplexer, but DSL can do okay 1.54 to 30 megabits plus. It's a distance-limited service, so if you're real close to the central office, you can go way up. My buddy lives a couple of blocks away from the Stewart switch down there at Stewart and Robinson. He can get 50 megabits off of his DSL, and it is primo DSL. He's not complaining about it at all. So this is out there and needs to be questioned in your neighborhood because lots of DSL service is oversold. There's out in the community or in the central office, the DSL has an area multiplexer, so that's a DSLAM, DSL area multiplexer, and there's one in the telephone company. There's one out in the community. So on the other end of that, you're not going the full mile back to the central office. You're going the block or two before you have to share the bandwidth in this multiplexer with everybody else in the neighborhood. So as long as the telephone company hasn't oversold their DSL service, it can be very good. We got another one like that. If you go after, I'll start writing over here, cable is plain coax, so you're sharing the bandwidth with everybody in your neighborhood. It's just one coaxial cable that might service 100 or more houses. Nowadays, we've got Xfinity is added to our cable, and that is fiber to the neighborhood. That is the hybrid. It's fiber to the neighborhood, and then it is coax to the doorstep. TDS to doorstep. So this is hybrid, and I saw it happen in my neighborhood. I also saw the service improved in my neighborhood. They came along first, and as people started subscribing for it, they came to a big gray box in the neighborhood, and they brought a fiber optic circuit to that gray box. Then they plugged the gray box into the coaxial cable that's been in that neighborhood for nearly 30 years. So last time I went back to cable, I had been off it for 10 or 15 years, and all they did was pull up the old wire and plug me into it. It's out there, it's reliable.